The clock is ticking on cash. Will Australia learn from other nations' mistakes in time? And fearless Australian Senator exposes Western intelligence psyop. Coming up on today's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 6th of February 2025. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks, Lisa.
And on today's show, we're going to be discussing the latest front in the war on cash, which involves its actual physical delivery to the places where it's needed. And then we're going to talk about a major confrontation in Parliament exposing the war on terror for what it really is, a psyop. So stay tuned for that one for sure. Now, to help us get the word around, make sure you are subscribed and ring the notification bell, but also please circulate it on the show on social media as you can. Put a comment below and generally get the word out. And if you can donate to help us continue to run the campaigns that we're doing, and apart from your personal engagement, of course, which is critical, and we'll come to that in a moment, but you can also donate financially, and you'll find a link for that below also. Right, so straight into it this week. The clock is ticking on cash. Will Australia learn from other nations' mistakes in time? We're going to provide in a moment an international perspective on what it means to go cashless and some of the unexpected ramifications of that. But for Australia, it's not unexpected because we can learn from the mistakes of others.
This is one of the most insane things about what's been happening in Australia is there are countries around the world, especially in Europe, you can look at and say, look, it didn't work. It's a disaster. And you cannot exaggerate how much of a disaster it's been. And they are regretting what they've done and coming back, and we'll give you the details of that. So what on earth are we doing in this country not to learn from that, right?
Crazy. And
we have a ticking time bomb right now, Elisa, up to the 17th of July, I think. There's a deadline looming, which we're going to explain to people. We better get our act together by then, or else it could be curtains.
Yes. Now, just to remind people, and we'll come back to this again, there is a consultation that the Australian government is conducting on the future of cash, in which they claim that they want to mandate cash to be accepted in businesses across Australia. There are certain considerations that come into that, which is the fact that small businesses would be exempted, and they form 98% of businesses across Australia. So, there's big question marks there. So we want you, as we've said in previous shows, to make a submission to that consultation and demand this be it should be far more far-reaching than this, but in fact there's already a solution that has been tabled, and that was put forward at the conclusion of the inquiry on regional bank closures, which we played a major role in, and that solution is to immediately go with a postal bank to ensure that cash is made available, because businesses are much happier to take cash and able to take cash if they can bank and if they can access.
Exactly. The driver of the unwillingness to accept cash is the expense of having to go a long distance to bank the damn thing, right? So, and the banks have caused that problem, and so that's the solution. The other part of the solution that was in that report from the Senate inquiry, Elisa, was to declare access to cash and banking services an essential service, right? So the government could do that. Instead, they're coming up with this mandate idea where they're exempting 98% of businesses in Australia from the mandate. So it's ludicrous, and we need to get generate as many submissions as possible. So that say, basically, just make it simple. Make everyone accept cash, make the banks provide it, right? Essentially, and if the banks aren't going to provide it, start a postal bank that can provide it. So use the link below, but please, you've got till Valentine's Day, the 14th of February, make a submission.
Yep, so make sure you do that. Now, the clock is ticking, though, in another way, which you just mentioned, and this is regarding the cash distribution system. So everyone knows, of course, that Armaguard's been in trouble, which is a virtual monopoly on cash distribution, and there's been a lot of problems there ongoing, and we need a solution to it. They have not yet found a workable solution, and we're going to propose one in our win-win approach of solving both the problem with banks closing down, people not being able to access banking services, and supporting Australia Post to continue to be profitable, and particularly the licensees to be able to operate in a way that's profitable, and they can continue doing that and not just carry the cost of servicing all the banking that the banks have just left the field and left to them. And that is, in terms of cash distribution, the role of Australia Post could be incorporated, because right now people may not be aware, but cash distribution is actually operated in an interesting way. It's jointly done by Armaguard, or the actual distributor, in conjunction with Westpac Bank. And this is something that's been an arrangement for some 3 decades, I believe.
Two decades.
2 decades.
Well, what happened is the RBA contracted out to the banks to take responsibility for the distribution of cash. And Westpac bid for the contract. So you have this funny situation where when the bank leaves the RBA, because the RBA prints the money, when the cash leaves the RBA prints it. Westpac is the contractor to get the distribution to all the banks. So the Westpac subcontracts to Armaguard, etc. Westpac owns the cash and the liability, right, for the cash until such time it ends up in the bank's vaults of its own banks and its competitors, right? And this is a contract that Westpac initially wanted, because it would have been very lucrative back in the day when there was more cash being used. But now Westpac and the other banks have reduced the amount of cash that's being used in transactions for their own purposes. The expenses of this have grown disproportionate, right? And so they're not keen to renew the contract. The contract, Elisa, comes up for renewal on the 18th of July. And if they don't arrange something by then, so it's the RBA and the private banks and essentially Armaguard, if they don't come up with another arrangement by then, the article that James Ayres wrote on the 5th of February in the Financial Review said this could be a disaster.
Yeah.
The distribution of cash could grind to a halt, right? And if the distribution of cash grinds to a halt, then we'll have trouble.
So on Wednesday there was a meeting about this between the banks and Treasury, and the Reserve Bank hosted it at their headquarters. But they haven't solved anything. They're meeting again in 2 weeks' time. But they are saying things like the movement of cash has to be treated like any other utility, like water or something that needs to be moved from point A to point B.
Well, and see, by making an acknowledgement like that, then you've got to take stock of what they're actually admitting here, because who's responsible for utilities? Even if they're privately owned, it's the government that's allowed them to be privately owned. The government is responsible for utilities. And let me give you a little bit of the history of why this is even an issue. Back in 1996-97, John Howard finished off Paul Keating's privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank. Up to that point, the federal government had one banker, and that was the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank did all the banking for the whole federal government. In this privatisation zeal, they'd privatised the Commonwealth Bank, and then the federal government had this idea that all the different government departments of the federal government, except for the Department of Finance, which is where our tax dollars get paid back into the economy from, except for that department, all the other departments, they could use private banks if they wanted. Now, this was a massive boon for the private banks. Suddenly they become the banker to the Department of Defence, the Department of Social Security, the Department of this, the Department of that. You know, and it's Westpac and it's NAB and it's Commonwealth and it's ANZ, etc. They've got these contracts to do this stuff, right? And up to that point, because Westpac had the whole lot, because the Reserve Bank had the whole lot, of banking to the government, the Reserve Bank also took care of cash distribution. And they had these depots around Australia where they would take cash to, and then from the depots they would take it out to the bank. It was a much more efficient system. And so they decided to downsize all that as well, because their excuse was, well, since we're not doing most of the government's work now, there's less demand for staff in our branches in all the different states, so we'll downsize those branches. And if we're going to downsize them for that, then we don't want to be kept carrying cash either. We'll outsource that to the private sector, right? And at first, this, like I said, this was lucrative for Westpac. They jumped on it. But now they have caused this problem by aggressively suppressing the use of cash in the economy, where now they don't want to carry it. Why is this urgent? I think there's two reasons. This, before people think this is just a dry technical thing. What happens if we do go cashless? Well, there's two things I want to warn people about.
Very suddenly too.
Yeah, there's two things I want to warn people about. One is, should be obvious, the practical problem. We are exposing ourselves to all kinds of disaster when power fails, communications fail, and natural floods and fires and that happen, right? And there's no cash to keep the economy going because all the other systems are down. That is lunacy. That's what we're going to talk about with these European countries, right? That is lunacy. That itself is just nuts. That's one problem. But the other problem is more Orwellian, which is that when you have cash in your hand, what you do with that cash is an entirely sovereign decision. But as people like, even Bob Catter warns about this, when you're using a card or your phone or whatever to transact, you may not know this, you don't think about it, but you tap that machine, a message of permission to your bank is sent out for you to transact. And yes, you've never had the bank say no. But if all of your transactions have to go through that bank and they've got all that extra power over you, right? They will find ways to say no if they decide to. And we've already had an issue of that in Australia with what they call debanking, where banks have said, oh, okay, we don't like certain kind of businesses. And it's a big ruckus right now in New Zealand as well, where the private banks have turned around and debanked not only a company in the name of climate change action, to meet the bank's climate change targets. Not only have they debanked companies that work for coal mines, like service companies, they've also started debanking petrol stations. Petrol stations in New Zealand are finding it hard to get bank accounts because these lunatic banks have been able to pursue their own stupid climate change accounting goals and don't care about the consequences. And so the government's going tut, 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 tut about it, but that's what the sort of stuff the banks can do. You do not, the bigger the cash component of the economy is, the banks have that much less power. The smaller it is, the banks have that much more power. Do we want these bastard banks to have more power? And so the clock is ticking, Elisa, for the 18th of July, and we have a solution. The solution is simple. That's enough time to start a post office bank. Bring back a government bank. Take it all out of their hands. Every bank, every post office can be a bank, and the cash system can be kept alive that way.
Well, Australia Post happened to do deliveries, so,
Well, there's a history to this. There was, in the 1999 first ever parliamentary inquiry into bank closures, one of the submissions made pointed out that in regional Western Australia, up until the mid-90s, Australia Post did handle the cash distribution. And they did it really cheaply. So the submission said that when Australia Post was delivering the cash to banks in WA, the cost to each bank branch per week for their cash delivery was $20. When Australia Post ended it, and who knows why, but they cited security reasons and whatever. So when Australia Post was replaced by private contractors like Armaguard and whatever, the cost per week to the bank branch went up to $600. $20 to $600. And when we did the regional bank closures inquiry, and I went to every hearing, the small banks that testified before those hearings said that the cost of cash handling and storage and distribution is in the top 3 expenses of every bank branch in Australia because we took it off Australia Post. So let's give it back to Australia Post, right? Let's stop letting these bastards come up with excuses to take away our cash because if we don't, we face a future like Europe. And what's that been like?
Well, yes, and I was just going to say Crybaby Common should be happy about it because he was crying about the cost of cash. But in Europe, yes, let's have a look because, and you can read all of the details because I can't go through them all in the Australian Alert Service. You can get a copy of that from us if you haven't seen it before, or subscribe at the link below. So what became very clear, I was just updating some of the situation in Europe where for some years now, some of these nations, particularly the Nordic nations, so Norway, Finland, Denmark and Sweden, who have most prominently become virtually cashless, or what they consider to be called cashless, have been winding it back. They've been retreating from that position quite rapidly, and every time I go and have another look, there's another nation moving that way. So the Netherlands, for instance, has just made similar moves in that direction. So there's a list, and there may be more beyond what I've had a chance to find out. But and we can put up some of the headlines of this, because particularly in this era of financial crisis and war, what is being reported by central bank chiefs, governments, and even throughout the mainstream press is that if you don't have cash, all of the problems that arise due to cyber attacks, scams, frauds, energy failures, technology failures, system failures, whether they're war-related, like cyber attacks, for instance, could be, or economic-related, they are all made dramatically worse if there's no cash, because there's simply no alternative.
Yep.
So that's the major factor that is propelling the drive to restore cash, and to make banks make them supply it by legislation, make businesses accept it, so that the economy can continue to function in a crisis. And one of the dramatic things, of course, last year, midway through the year, was the CrowdStrike outage, which led to problems with Microsoft worldwide. That was a key point, which you can see this headline from the UK Daily Mail: global IT meltdown shows peril of going cashless. But throughout Europe, there's also been a whole series of other similar outages and events that have just kept pummeling nations. I mean, one of the things which is interesting actually is when you look at Sweden, Fortune magazine had this headline: why going cashless has turned Sweden from one of the safest countries into a high crime nation. So
that is so ironic.
Yeah.
When in 2019, when this Morrison government tried to ban cash transactions over $10,000, and we helped lead the fight to stop that, and we did stop it. They were using a recommendation from what was called the Black Economy Task Force, which was about cracking down on crime in the black economy. And they said the way to crack down on crime in the black economy is reduce cash.
Yeah.
Well, Sweden has shown that reducing cash actually causes a crime explosion.
Yeah.
We knew these guys were full of it.
Yeah.
But you know that's just they come up with these arguments, assuming people will just accept them, and the opposite's true.
That article, which was from June 2024, elaborates that, you know, once they got rid of cash altogether, online fraud and digital crime just exploded. But that also fed other types of crime of all kinds, including violence and all kinds of things. You know, one thing leads to another in that sense. So this has led to a spate of various warnings, as I mentioned, and I'll just mention a few. For instance, the Norwegian Directorate for Civil Protection, and they put out a warning. The Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency literally put a leaflet through the mail using old technology, urging people to keep cash so they can handle to buy a week worth of essentials in case of emergency. At the time of the CrowdStrike outage, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, interestingly enough, and the National Emergency Management Agency and Citizens Advice Bureau, they also put out warnings saying you should keep cash for emergencies. And this is what the Reserve Bank of New Zealand spokesman said. He said the Reserve Bank and National Emergency Management Agency recommend having cash on hand for emergencies, ideally in coins and smaller denominations. And the Citizens Advice Bureau said our law currently provides no protections around cash acceptance. They said to ensure cash remains a viable option, we also need government and businesses that provide essential goods to commit to accepting cash payments. Sweden amended their laws to ensure reasonable access to cash services, and that wasn't enough. They followed up where the central bank, the Riksbank, put out a 2024 payments report last year calling on the government to introduce obligation for merchants to accept cash for essential services and goods, and forcing banks to accept deposits, and that was subject to an inquiry which was due to report at the end of last year. I haven't seen that report yet.
Forcing banks to accept deposits, so that would be useful for ANZ Bank at the moment, which wants to start all these cashless branches.
Yeah, a lot of the big banks in these countries, like Denmark for instance, don't have any cash over the counter unless by appointment. You know, there's no cash services unless you make an appointment. The smaller ones are a little bit better, but now in Finland, the head of payment systems department at the Bank of Finland has urged people a while ago to keep cash on hand. This was on national television in case of systems interruptions, so that's how serious it's getting. The central bank there has proposed legislation to protect cash access. In Norway, they have a law that makes cash a compulsory payment method, but they have found that businesses have found ways to get around it. So they amended the legislation, which became effective in October 2024, to tighten and increase the oversight of those mandates. In Denmark, in 2023, the central bank put out a report. They were actually considering widening the exemptions, because most of these countries that have mandates, they do allow exemptions, but they're just for things like, in the case of Denmark, very remote trading, things like markets and festivals, self-checkouts. So if you go to a self-checkout, you won't necessarily have the option for cash. So those things are exempted, and that's mainly due to the cost of cash. But and getting
tiny,
it to places.
Tiny exemptions, not like what Jim
That's
Chalmers
right.
is
They are.
proposing.
They're not 98% of businesses being exempted.
Yep.
But the Denmark bank also admitted in its report that the cost of cash is the bank's fault because they're not making it available. And just to mention the Netherlands, which was the other dramatic one, in October 2024, the Monetary Affairs Chief at the Dutch National Bank, which is the central bank, warned of system outages, cybercrime, artificial intelligence shuttering multiple banks at one time. He said this could lead to a run, which may lead to the Dutch National Bank having to block financial transactions. Then people can no longer access their money. You don't want that. And he went on to say you'll have to have cash under the mattresses. But similar legislation, I won't go through it, has been put up in Spain, the UK, Austria, France, and even the European Commission, which is still under deliberation at the moment, to have cash acceptance mandated. And
So Elisa, you don't work for the Australian Treasury. The people who do work for the Australian Treasury under Jim Chalmers are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why don't they know what you were able to pull together in a week for an article for our Australian Alert Service? Because how can you look at that body of evidence and say, oh, let's keep going down that path? This is, why aren't we learning from these? Are we going to learn from these other countries' mistakes in time?
No, exactly. And I will note that the Reserve Bank knows this, at least in part, because I just happened to read, after doing all that work, this latest quarterly bulletin update on cash access that the Reserve Bank put out at the end of January. And I won't go through the details, you can read it in the alert, but they do say at the end of it, because they reference the fact that the government's doing a consultation, and then they say, oh, we intend to support this, or we're committed to supporting this. They didn't say they're supporting it. But then they cited the challenges faced overseas by countries in preserving cash and referenced the fact that many governments and central banks have had to intervene. And these responses largely, they said, place specific obligations on banks and financial institutions as the providers of cash services. Ooh, wow.
It's their responsibility.
Exactly, but they didn't say we're going to do that too. No.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll leave it there for that subject, but this is something that you can have a say in by putting in your submission to this cash consultation by the 14th of February.
And the key part of this, the real reason to make a submission is plug the post office bank.
Yep.
Let's start a public bank. If the private banks don't want to be in the business of banking for people,
They don't have to.
Right? Let's start a bank that will, and take all that power of banking and put it to use for the common good of everybody, not for the fat profits of shareholders of the banks, 80% of whom are overseas.
Yep.
Right? That's what the Post Office Bank will do. And Elisa, can do a quick shout out to my new mate Goran, who I bumped into at the Oak Park Post Office this week when I had to run in there and pick up a parcel before it closed. And Goran was in there trying to see if he can get photo ID for his elderly mother. And that particular post office couldn't help, but other post offices can. They directed him where to go. But I spoke to him outside and said, how long your mum's been a customer of the bank? Because he said she needs it from the bank. The bank says she needs photo ID. I said, how long has she been a customer? And he said, 30 plus years. And I said, these banks, they're just bastards. Why should an elderly lady be required to get photo ID at this stage? Anyway, and then I said, look, I'm part of a political party, the Citizens Party, that's fighting on these issues. And he goes, Australian Citizens Party? And I said, yeah. And he goes, and looks at me and goes, Robbie Barwick, because he saw my name on my card. I said, yeah. He said, I watched your show. So good on you, Goran. Thanks for watching the show.
He had his hat and sunnies on,
I was a bit
couldn't
disguised.
recognise him.
But yeah, that was just a random incident that happened to bump into someone who watches the show.
Yep. All right, now let's move on to the next topic. Senator exposes Western intelligence psyop. Now we're going to show a video clip here of Independent Senator Gerard Rennick.
People's First Senator Gerard Rennick.
That's correct.
Gerard's got a party now.
So now this is excellent. I'll let you introduce it, but basically this is the first time the mask has been ripped off of this whole facade of the war on terror.
Yeah, 21 years ago, the biggest scam of the 21st century started, called the war on terror, and the first part. The first and worst part of the scam happened straight away with the Iraq War. And evilly, very unscrupulous individuals, people like Dick Cheney and Australian Prime Minister John Howard, tried to tie Saddam Hussein into Al-Qaeda, when the number one enemy in the world of Al-Qaeda was Saddam Hussein. And it was all this rubbish they were coming up with as excuses to invade Iraq, and eventually they set on weapons of mass destruction. So we know all that. But then as it kept unfolding, then it got worse, because we found ourselves in these regime change wars in Libya and Syria, where suddenly our side is on the side of Al-Qaeda, the people who were supposedly fighting in the war on terror. And organisations like us, this helped fuel the rise of alternative media, Elisa. The reason there's such a big alternative media online, this issue is the number one reason for it, right? Because more and more people started saying, hang on, this is all lies. The enemies that flew the planes into the towers, and suddenly we're backing what they're doing in Syria and Libya and that. But it's never, among the major parties, this subject has never been spoken of in the Parliament of Australia, which is the parliament of a lapdog country that has gone along with every one of these crimes, right? Until yesterday. Former Liberal, who's been kicked out of his own party, and now Independent Senator Gerard Rennick. And can I say this? Senator Rennick has not had an epiphany here. He mentioned in his maiden speech 6 years ago, he touched on some of these issues, just not quite as explicitly as he did yesterday. So what he did yesterday, he hopped up and asked a question that hasn't been asked in 21 years in our parliament. It's actually historic. To Foreign Minister Penny Wong. And we're going to play the whole 6 minutes, because in the Senate you get a question and 2 supplementaries, right? So just watch the exchange between Senator Rennick and Senator Wong, the Foreign Minister, and just appreciate the historical nature of what you're listening to. The truth is coming to the fore.
Senator Rennick.
My question is to the Foreign Minister, Senator Wong. The country of Syria has recently been overthrown by terrorists formerly associated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. There are reports these terrorists are abusing and killing Christians and other minorities. In 2012, the then US Deputy Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, sent an email to Hillary Clinton saying that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. In 2016, the LA Times reported that terrorists funded by the Pentagon are fighting terrorists funded by the CIA in Syria. Given the Australian government has previously condemned the Assad regime for its atrocities, why has the Australian government said nothing about the human rights abuses in Syria committed by the current regime, and is this because Australian foreign policy is controlled by deep state Western intelligence agencies more interested in imperialism than upholding human rights and democratic values?
Thank you, Senator Rennick. Minister Wong.
Thank you for the question, Senator Rennick. And in relation to the last assertion, I would reject that. And I would say to you, Australia always should and continues to support international law and human rights. And obviously how we reflect that support it varies, and it may be bilateral consultations, it may be public statements, it may be what we talk to people about privately, it may be what we talk about publicly. But as a given who we are and the values and interests that Australia has, international law, including respect for human rights, matters to us. You are correct that there was the Assad regime has fallen. Obviously, that ends decades of brutal oppression, and we hope it could be the end of what has been a horrific period for Syrians marred by conflict, division and displacement. What I have articulated previously at the time of the overthrow of the Assad regime is a call on all parties to protect civilians, to refrain from violence and to prioritise dialogue. In relation to the organisation which was involved in both the overthrow and is also part of the current Syrian regime, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. I would just say to you, Senator, Australia listed HTS as a terrorist organisation in 2022 due to concerns over its conduct. Obviously, we again would say it's critical that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other armed groups who are now in control protect all Syrian civilians, and like other partners, we will be watching the actions of HTS in the period ahead.
Senator Rennick, first supplementary.
Thank you. What does the Australian government have to say to Australian veterans who served and died for their country in Iraq and Afghanistan, only to find out that they were fighting for imperialist organisations that were lying to them? The first being chemical weapons in Iraq and the second being al-Qaeda is the enemy in Afghanistan, when al-Qaeda was actually being funded by the same imperialist organisations.
Minister Wong.
Well, it is true, certainly in relation to the assertion of weapons of mass destruction, that history has demonstrated the problematic nature of some of the decisions that were made by past governments. But can I say what I would say to all veterans is that we always stand with the men and women in the ADF who serve the government of the day, who engage in action overseas when asked to, who serve Australia bravely, and we always thank them for their service, regardless of whether or not at the time or subsequently people may have different views about the government's decisions at the time. We are very privileged and honoured in this country to have very fine men and women in the Australian Defence Force who demonstrate discipline, courage, determination, professionalism across the globe.
Minister, the time for answering has expired. Senator Rennick, second supplementary.
Will the minister please ask our intelligence agencies if the entire war on terror over the last 2 decades has been nothing but a Western intelligence psyop campaign designed to advance Western imperial interests in the Middle East? And does this campaign include funding Hamas, given the deep state has funded other Islamic terrorist organisations such as ISIS and al-Qaeda through programs such as Timber Sycamore?
Thank you, Senator Rennick. Minister Wong.
Senator Rennick, whatever your views, I don't think it would be correct to say that the threat of and the existence of terrorism is not something that Australian governments across the globe have to deal with. It is the case. But what I would say to you is we have to deal with that, both by being very focused on national security matters, on making sure we take the advice of agencies, including our intelligence agencies, but also our law enforcement agencies. And we also have to deal with some of the conflicts and misinformation which give rise to that sort of hateful ideology. But I thank you for your interest in these matters. But on some of these issues, I don't agree with how you are articulating some of the past history.
And at the end there, notice Penny Wong when he asked about the veterans, and she's like, oh yes, we thank them for their service. I mean, basically, regardless of whether the whole war was a crock or not, I mean, tell that to the families of the people that died over there.
Yeah, look, if people want to rewind back and look at it, Penny Wong has been trained to deal with difficult questions, and what she did was she dealt with the letter of the question. So Gerard asked, how should veterans feel, etc.
Yeah.
And instead of dealing with the substance of the question, right? And that was her way of deflecting, because otherwise she's not used to dealing with those kind of questions. Even though it did appear she was reading from notes at the beginning, and these are called questions without notice. She did not have notice, but it's like in her folder of possible answers, someone once upon a time wrote for the foreign minister, one day you may get asked this question, right? Have this
It's unlikely,
response. But these are the big issues. Senator Rennick called out the whole thing as a Western intelligence psyop, and that's quite explosive.
And the fact that she had to admit terrorists are in charge to, an
admitted
organisation that we decree a terrorist
The
organisation.
current government of Syria is listed as terrorist organisations in Australia, and so by admitting that, she's admitting that when our closest allies like the British, the British have gone there, the Germans have gone there,
we've all praised
etc.,
the takeover.
sat down with this terrorist in charge of
that's okay.
Syria.
That's
Yep.
okay.
Just he needs to abide by international law as well, apparently.
Yeah. And now I wanted to mention, by way of a quick plug, talking about independent media that exposed all this, and of course, this was where the rise of WikiLeaks and other things like that was so crucial. But one of the important media outlets that's independent right now is Michael West Media, and they are being sued. So people can go to their website and find out the details of the crowdfunding that they will need to fight this lawsuit.
Well, we can put the links below. We'll put the link to the video that Michael West made about this lawsuit, and then the link to where people can support his fight against the people that are suing him. And this relates to the gang in Australia that don't serve our interests but serve America's interests, who are trying to stoke a war with the United States.
And with China.
Sorry, the gang in
trying to stoke a war with China.
China by the United States.
Yeah.
One other thing, Elisa, just quickly, is that we cover in the alert this week is it's got to be mentioned is the saga of Oscar Jenkins, and this guy is just a tool for propaganda, right? Because look how gleefully the whole Australian media jumped on news that he'd been executed by the Russians. This is the Australian mercenary in Russia, in Ukraine, and he'd been gleefully. It's like, oh yeah, see how evil the Russians are, and then of course the news has broken now that it hasn't been executed, and Albanese and Penny Wong get up there and they moralise like crazy, right? But one of the things that we point out is this guy is actually a mercenary, and he's not a prisoner of war, and it's a very different thing. And we give the legal distinction, which Penny Wong knows, right? But these are propaganda things. And that's them just continuing to play the game that Senator Rennick was trying to expose in that question, right? And then final thing from me, just to mention it because it has to be mentioned. Donald Trump is a loose cannon and a mixed bag, but that means sometimes the mix in the bag is really, really bad. And what he announced yesterday is really, 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 really bad. This Gaza thing that he announced, I don't know if it's a brain fart or what, it is ethnic cleansing. It is if he thinks that the Palestinians, who for 76 years have been prepared to die to fight to reclaim their land, are going to give up Gaza because he wants to turn it into the Riviera of the Eastern Mediterranean. This is where do these dumb ideas come from? But the problem is this is the worst side of the Trump administration. His administration is stacked with pro-Zionist lunatics, including Christian Zionists, people who believe that they want to blow up restore the nation of Israel to bring back the second coming of Christ, or bring about the coming of the Messiah, or whatever religious lunacy that has been the big long-term driver of this conflict. And we'll have more to say about it in the future. But the reason, because sometimes we will compliment Trump on some of the things he does on this show, but the reason that people have to condemn the bad things forcefully is because how's he going to get the message to back off if his own supporters just kiss his butt and everything he does, right? We're not his supporters, but we're going to make sure that, if we can bring about peace in Ukraine, well and good. But what's the point of doing that if he literally blows up the world by doing this in the Middle East,
Yep.
right? And people have to push back and push back hard and look at the big picture here. And so, we'll have some more to say about that in the future.
Yeah, that just really reiterates why Australia needs to have an independent foreign policy. So on each of these issues, we can make our own mind up and influence the way the world
exactly,
goes.
and talk frankly about it instead of just be dragged along by the nose.
Yeah. All right, that's the show. Contact us for more and to find out, about other things you can engage with.
And make a submission by the 14th of February
Yeah.
to the cash mandate acceptance inquiry.
Thank you in advance. Thanks, Robbie, and thank you, and tune in next week.
Thanks.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.